Welcome, everyone. Good morning. It's an early start, at least for me. uh, my name is Carlos Aguilar, and I'm a senior developer on the product team of IIS. How many of you were here yesterday for part one? Cool, like 90%. Anyway, it doesn't matter. We're going to look to something completely different today, except it's very related, which is what is configuration and why should you care as a developer about the configuration system in IIS. Why it can provide you with a bunch of new tools that will make your life easier and better when you run within IIS 7. So yesterday, we took a look at how to extend the runtime, how to be able to plug in our own functionality within the web server. And I'll probably show the code just really quickly for those of you that didn't made it yesterday. Today, what we're going to look at is, okay, how not everything in an application, in a product, is having the ability to do something at the runtime. You also want to expose a nice view to your users so that they can configure it, whether it's using command line tools, whether it's using Notepad, whether it's using a UI. So today what we're going to look at is how do I take that functionality, that value that IIS provided me in the web server, and now make it available to my end user so that he can configure and play nicely with the whole feature set of IIS. So with that, let's first take a look at the configuration system today, .NET. I'm guessing most of you are familiar with the configuration system of .NET, system.configuration, and how it works. But if you're not, it's really easy. There is a central machine-wide file called machine.config right there. Oh, my bad. Right here. So this is the machine configuration. It stores all the .NET global settings, including web application settings and non-web application settings, such as connection strings. It has information about debugging information, WinForms, everything lives right there. Its framework version is specific. So if you have a version 2 of the framework, it has its own configuration folder. If you have B11 or 3.5, I'm sorry, I take that back. 3.5 is not the case. But if you have B11, it has its own folder. B20 has its own folder. Then there's the root web config. The root web config, in a way, inherits from machine.config. And that's where all the ASP.NET related settings live. Okay? This was introduced in version 2 of the framework, if I remember correctly. And it's where all the ASP.NET settings have moved so that there's not a lot of the web settings in the machine config. Finally, within your application and any folder or any subfolder, you can have web configs. All of them, as I said, inherit all the functionality. So if you go to machine config and configure something, all of the further configuration files, like the root web config and the side web config, inherit those values. So that way, you can configure it very easily. If you want to share a connection string to a database for all of your web applications, you can place it in machine config, and suddenly everyone has access to it. Or you can just go and put it into a specific web config, and then it only applies to it. Okay? So that is today. That is the .NET framework, and life was really good. So while creating IIS 7, we looked at the feedback that our customers were giving us. And the feedback was, this functionality is absolutely great. Because first of all, it allows me to have a centralized store, which is good. It's a centralized store, machine.config, the root web config, that only administrators can change. In there, I can have all the settings that I want to protect, I want to enforce, or provide by default. But then I can actually delegate to my developers, to my whoever, the ability to create web configs and potentially override the settings, or simply just add new settings that I don't care about. And so it's a very nice world. So what we did in IIS 7 is we introduced, in a way, like a parallel or new file. This new file is called applicationhost.config. How many of you were familiar with the metabase, IIS6 metabase? Well, the good news for you, I hope, is that it's dead. There's no more metabase, okay? So that thing is long gone in the past. Now, don't panic. Everything you know about the metabase still applies. And if you have built application, scripts, or anything that modifies the metabase, happens to be that we build a compatibility layer, so your scripts, your applications will remain running as usual. So no need to panic there. But the new configuration system is very, very similar. It's using the same concepts that the .NET framework did and introduced over 5 years ago. So we have our central settings, again, administrator only. That's where the IT pro or whoever owns the box gets to choose which settings to configure by default. But then we made smarter web config files. So now web config files can hold not only ASP.NET related settings, but they can also hold the IIS settings. Any questions about this? Now, as you can see, the inheritance is a little bit funky. The first thing that might come to your mind is, why didn't you guys use the root web config? Because that's where the web settings are, right? Well, that's the reason I mentioned that those two files, the machine config and the root web config, are .NET version specific. And we needed in IIS a way to have our own configuration, which was isolated from the multiple versions of the .NET framework, because IIS 7 can execute applications from V11 or V20 or different versions. So we needed our own central file. Besides, it actually makes sense because that's the point where you want to define what's an application to IIS. What is an application pool? So it has different settings, and it's huge. If you think ASP.NET settings has a lot of tweaks or configuration settings, well, ours is 20 times bigger. And I'll show you in a second how it looks like. Okay. So best thing, and I'm going to go through all the concepts in a second, but the best thing is that, again, our IIS settings live in applicationhost.config. However, it can be delegated to be stored in a web.config. Some of them are delegated by default, and I'll explain exactly what it means. Some of them are not. Another interesting thing is, in the .NET framework world, you didn't really know what settings were available for any section, right? So if I ask you, how do I know which settings are available for the app settings collection, which is configuration settings of .NET framework? Well, there was no way for you to easily know other than go into the documentation and hopefully it's accurate and hopefully somebody, updated for the next version of the framework, and hopefully I'm looking at the right one because, I might be lost. However, we decided to go in a different route. We decided in IIS to use the no-code option. What we want to do is have a schema or something that is very similar to an XML schema and define how your configuration actually looks like. Okay, you tell me what options are available, which values are valid or not, what's the default value, what's the data type of your configuration setting. Another interesting thing that we actually went ahead and did is enable a new feature called shared configuration. So we have this centralized file, right? All of the settings for IIS have moved into this XML. Well, why don't you let me have it in a UNC share in a separate machine where 100, 200 web servers are pointing to the exact same file. So when I go ahead and do a modification, all of my servers in the web farm immediately get that. So I create a new site and boom, and just do it whatever, Notepad, init manager, you name it. Suddenly the 100 web servers have the same application created or any settings you want to change. So I'll show that in a second. And finally, the most important thing for us developers is you can extend it to put all your settings and all the things you want, whether it's a product, an application, whatever, you can dump them into our configuration files and leverage the same functionality of inheritance or delegation, locking, and all the things that I'm going to show in a second. Okay. Questions so far? Well, let's. All the files for IIS live in this nice little folder. Okay. So if I go there, that's where all the binaries live. Nothing really interesting. However, there is a subfolder called config. Okay. Config is, by the way, is this readable by everyone? Is that okay? Perfect. In here, you'll find that we have 3 configuration files: administration.config, applicationhost.config, and redirection.config. And I'll talk about each of them. But for now, let's focus on applicationhost.config, which is the file that we just mentioned. So I'm just going to open this guy in Visual Studio. And for those of you familiar with the ASP or .NET framework in general, you'll notice that it's a very, very similar syntax. There are a bunch of configuration sections at the top. In fact, let me chocolate that loading. This is the way it looks like. So the file is basically split in 2 sections. The first section, which are the config sections, this is where we tell you all the things that you can use here in this file or later in child web configs or deeper in the hierarchy. And then the actual data. This is where you actually consume that data. So I'll show you exactly what I mean. So here, for example, I'm declaring that there's going to be a section group called system.applicationhost, and that there's going to be a group called system.webserver. For those of you that remember yesterday, we saw some of the system web server settings in the web config. For those of you that didn't, we'll see it in a second. But this is exactly why this is valid. Now, underneath each of the groups, you'll see all the settings that we can actually touch. So in this case, we're defining that there's a section called application pools. There is a section called config history. Application pools, as you would expect, holds the application pools of IIS. The config history has all the configuration settings to keep a history of the config as you make changes. So when you change our configuration, we'll make a backup for you automatically every something. You can configure that. We have some, the definition of the sites, for example. But again, this is just, if we think about like C++ code, this would be the pound include, and then further down, there's actually all the declarations. So I'm actually going to go directly to the real data. The real data is right here. This is what we call a section group. And it has nothing, it acts as a container. It's just a container of sections. In this case, system.applicationhost has application pools. And as you would expect, it has a bunch of configuration. So how difficult would it be in the past in IIS if you want to create an application pool without using the UI? Well, good luck with that. You probably need to create an application or a script or something like that. So just to prove you that, I'm just going to open init Manager here, and I'll show you that my application pools are right there. So those are the 2 application pools. So I'm going to create one in like 2 seconds. That's it. I have a new application pool. And to prove, I'm just going to refresh, and it's right there. So absolutely everything, all the settings from IIS are stored in those configuration files. There's no, oh, now I need to go to the registry to tweak this thing. Oh, I need to go to, somewhere else to tweak anything. In fact, the UI, as you would imagine, if I go ahead here and change some of the settings, say, for example, I'm going to switch it to classic mode, okay? When I switch this guy of my new application pool to classic mode, guess what happens? Well, my application host.config change, oops, and the only change that happened is this little attribute right here was added. So whether you do it from the UI or you do it using XML or you do it using Notepad, we're both talking the same language. So that's pretty cool because it's super easy to do all the things you would imagine for IIS. Yes? Yeah, so the question is, how sensitive is this file? It's very sensitive. Uh, it's very sensitive. If you cause it to be invalid XML, it will stop the server. Okay, so you don't want to mess around and stop the whole do crazy things here. If you cause it to have invalid data, it will not stop the server. Okay, so if I mistype something here, if I do something with one specific application pool, well, you're going to break that one, but not the whole server. Other applications will remain working correctly. But definitely, indeed, you want to be careful of what you do here. Yes, question? Good question. So the question is, typically when you modify the web config, it causes the app domains from ASP.NET to recycle and start a new one, and it causes a little bit of an overhead, all the completion fires again and all that. Will changing this file recycle everything? And the answer is no. We are very careful on which settings will recycle everything and which settings recycle something. So say, for example, I go ahead and change something about default website or a particular application within default website. Well, we detect all the changes that you're doing, and we try to narrow it down to the smallest impact we can, and we will only recycle that particular application. Now, if you make a change, such as the global modules, which are the list of native code DLLs that we have to recycle everything, because basically we have to start the worker processes again so that they have this new DLL. So there are only very few cases where that will happen. Everything else should sometimes not even recycle anything at all. Sometimes it will recycle a very, tiny things, and sometimes, it will not. Okay, so moving forward. As you would imagine, guess what? Here's my default website. My default website is right here. So I think it's very readable that we have a site with a name default website with ID 1, and it has an application, root application, and it has a virtual directory that is pointing to system drive init-pub www-root. This will show you one interesting thing that we did with this file. Since we wanted this file to be machine agnostic, okay, we didn't want you to have c:init-pub www-root, and then you install in a different server the operating system in D drive or E drive. And then suddenly you cannot copy this file over and make it work because they have different drives. Well, we went our way to specify everything in terms of environment variables. So in this case, system drive, it's an environment variable of Windows that tells you where's the drive of the operating system. So if I were to copy this guy, even though my machine has the operating system in D, and I copy it into one that has it in C, then it will remain working perfectly fine, okay? And you'll notice all of our paths are like that. We're using system drive or Windir or all of those environment variables. So how difficult would it be to create a completely new virtual directory? So let's create a new my vdir. And I'll point it to, let me create to following bad practices. I'm going to put it hard-coded the whole thing. So if I just save this file and I go here, in fact, when I expand the full website, boom, it's right there. My vdir is actually right there, and I can see the basic settings of this guy, and it's pointing to the application. Okay, so it's super simple to do anything you want, whether it's using Notepad or anything else. Okay, the first question comes to my mind is, okay, so how do I know? What can I do? What values are valid? Say I want to set the username and the password of these guys. An example is, in init manager, I can actually set the user and password that I want to use to connect to that particular folder. How do I know how to save it? Which XML should I use? Well, that's where the schema files fall into place. And so underneath the config folder, which we've been looking at, there is a subfolder called schema, okay? In that folder, you'll find 4 files that we ship out of the box. They include ASP.NET schema, FX schema, IIS schema, and RISC-X. Now, all the configuration settings of IIS are stored and defined in IIS schema.xml. So it's the most important one, and I'm going to drop it here so we take a look at this one. And let me toggle outlining. Okay. As you can see, this is a place where we tell you each of the sections that IIS has. We have the section called application pool, the sites, the ASP settings, the caching settings, the CGI, default document, fast CGI, you name it. Absolutely all of the IIS settings are defined and schematized here. Again, it's not XSD, okay? It's not the formal XSD, standard XSD, and there is a reason for that. I mean, that's one of the first questions I get asked. The answer is, there were some semantics that we were not able to express in XSD, and XSD was overly complicated, or it was quite big for the things that we needed to define. So we chose to use a simpler, we think, more understandable model. And sorry, but that's what we came up with. So the idea, as you can see and as you would imagine, let's go to the site section. This is one of the biggest sections. The site section, which is this guy we talked about, has a collection with an add element named site. So right there, I know it's going to look sites, and underneath, I'm going to have a bunch of site elements. Underneath this guy, each site will have a name of type string that is required. You better have it. It's a unique key, okay? So be careful. Oops. And it has a specific validation. Now, it has an ID. It has a property called server auto start. This server auto start will basically tell IIS that as soon as you start, you better start this site as well. Now, you might wonder, well, how do I know? Well, we're working on all the documentation of each of these values. We're telling you when to set them, why you want to set them, and the recommended values. So today, I believe you can go to MSDN and you'll find information about all of those settings. But anyway, so we were in the scenario of I want to have, as you can see, sites have applications, and application has virtual directories. So guess what? Virtual directory has a path, a physical path, and a username and a password. So right there, now I know this is the things that I have to set, so I can just go ahead and type them in XML, and life should be good. Okay, cool. Now, of course, it comes the question, okay, you talked about delegation. You talked about the ability to set some of these values within my own web config, no matter where I am. How do I do that? Okay, let's go back to my temp app, our conveniently created temp app here. Here I am. Now I'm going to do a notepad. Let's call this, hello.htm. And we're going to do hello. And I'm just going to save it. If I go ahead and browse to my virtual directory, okay, so I'm just going to go here and browse to it. What's going to happen is that I get a forbidden entry in IIS. That is expected because I do not have a default document, right? I don't have default.aspx or default.htm or, index.htm, all the default documents that are defined by IIS. But what I really liked is the ability to say, hey, my default document for this application, only this application, is hello.htm. Well, guess what? In IIS 6 world, to do that, you have to be a server administrator. It's like, what? It's just a single application. I just want to set the default document. Well, no way. in order for you to be able to touch the metabase, you had to be server admin. In IIS7, on the other hand, I can just go ahead, create a web config. In fact, let me open this on Visual Studio. And I can just start configuration and say system.webserver and say default document files add hello.htm. That's it. You save this guy, no recycling whatsoever. I just go ahead and refresh. And boom. The forbidden is gone. My application has the configuration. I'm going to switch back. Very easy to understand, very easy to read, isn't it? So this is pretty interesting because now server administrators doesn't need to care. You know, how many times you as a developer, at least me as a developer, had to call the server administrator and say, hey, I know I don't have administrator privileges in the box, but could you please go into my application and add the default document hello.htm? It was all the time. And it was really lame. Or the other option was you always ended up having a default.aspx in your, in your application, just because default.aspx happens to be a default one. And again, as you would imagine, INET Manager actually is smart enough to get the right configuration. So if I go here to my default document feature and I go there, guess what? We actually tell you there's hello.htm and all the other ones, but we actually give you more information. We tell you where it came from. We're telling you, hey, you know all those files? You actually got them from your parent configuration. They are being inherited to you. But hello.htm is defined locally in your web.config, okay? So we actually tell you all the time context of where we read some settings, where they're coming from, and how to, understand them. Okay, so that's just a brief overview. Any questions about the config system? Absolutely. The question is, I suppose you can turn this off. Absolutely. As an IT manager, you want to keep control of what people can set and what they cannot, okay? And happens to be that you can do that. And I'm just going to show you, just to prove that it's really easy to do. If I went ahead and say default document, I'm here at the application host.config, centralized file. And as you can see, there is one extra tiny little flag that says, hey, do you want me to override, or do you want to allow people to override this in deeper configuration files? We in IIS looked into each and every single of the sections and see and analyze, should we turn this on by default or should we turn it off by default? Most of the settings of IIS, we turned it off. Okay, so you'll notice that there's a bunch of deny. That is because those settings, one, compatibility reason, and two, because we knew potentially an IT pro would like to keep control of them. For example, you don't necessarily want people to change the authentication settings. You don't want it to enable Windows authentication on their application because you probably want to keep control. I don't know, who knows? So we said, let's not delegate that by default. But default document is one of those that we looked and say, why would anyone even care what's the default document? It's my application. I should be able to do it. It has no risks whatsoever. So we looked in terms of security, we looked in terms of functionality, and we looked in terms of IT pros and developers. And we tried to make the best, guess, I guess, for what's the best default values, and that's what we went with. So that's specifically the reason I chose default document, because I know that one is delegated by default, such as directory browsing as well, and some of those. So yes, and you can change that, by the way. So in fact, let's actually change this. However, there are better ways of changing it. You should ideally not change this guy. You should change it in a different way, and I'll show you exactly how. I'm here at the very, very bottom, so I'm just going to scroll down a little bit. So for example, that change, if I save it, nothing is going to happen. No recycling whatsoever, because we detect that there's no real change, so we will not recycle any application. Okay, so what I'm going to say is, hey, for default website, slash my vidder, yes, my vidder, okay, only for that particular virtual directory, I don't want him to be able to do it. Okay? I don't want it. So what I'm going to do is say, hey, everything that I say here, they should not be able to override it. And exactly what I'm going to do is say system.webserver, default document. I'm just going to say that. By doing that, I'm telling them no one deeper in the hierarchy should be able, no, well, sorry, I take that back. No one deeper than that guy, including that guy, should be able to override it. So if I go to my web application and I refresh this guy, error. And you can see that it tells you the related configuration data for this page is invalid. We also tell you here, is that readable? This configuration section cannot be used at this path. This happens when the section has been locked at the parent level. Locking is either by default, override mode default deny, or set explicitly by allocation tag with override mode equals deny, or the legacy allow override equals false. By the way, you're trying to access this web config, which has these configuration settings which are violating all that stuff. So nice feature from IIS, very detailed documentation, even in the error messages. So we're telling you exactly what's going on, and so you should probably kind of figure it out and say, oops, I should remove that. And of course, if I go ahead and remove it from here, then life should be good. Now, sometimes it might be too much, right? I don't want to lock everything. I just want to make sure they have it enabled, right? There's an attribute called enable equals true. Oh, well, enabled. So maybe I want them to be able to add stuff to this, but I don't want them to turn it off, sorry. Well, guess what? We have semantics for that as well. So we have a very granular, I'm not going to drill down too much into this, but here's the default, by the way, the default value. This is the thing that gets inherited for the entire server. As you can see, it's enabled by default, and it has all the default values. Remember in my list of that I showed, a bunch of them showed as inherited. Here they're coming from, the centralized application host.config. So if I want to make sure everyone has it enabled, they should not be able to change enable attribute. I'm just going to say lock attribute enabled. At that point, anyone deeper in the file can still add default documents. They can still remove, they can still clear the collection. They can do anything they want with the collection, but they cannot touch the enabled attribute. If they touch the enabled attribute, the same violation will happen. And just to prove that, I'm going to save this guy. I'm going to go back to that, refresh, and boom. It really, look attributes. I'm sorry, it's a plural thing. Because you can put more than one there. So everything works. But if I want and touch my web.config and say enabled equals false, now it's going to complain again, and it's going to tell you, hey, you shouldn't, I'm sorry, having a lot of typos here. Enabled equals false, and I refresh this guy. I get the configuration, and it tells me, hey, there's a lock violation because you're setting the enable attribute. You should not be able to touch this attribute. And so again, very, very detailed, granular control. So we let you lock the specific items. We let you lock specific collections, specific attributes. We let you lock the entire section. We let you lock anything you want. And by the way, you don't have to lock this at the server level. You can, hey, you know what? I want my site administrators to be able to do anything, but all the applications should not be able to do certain stuff. So you can lock it at the site level, okay? So here within my web config, I can say, oh, and by the way, lock this guy. And so now any application or subfolder will not be able to remove this default document. So you can do a bunch of interesting stuff. Okay, moving forward to actually do the demo that I was going to do. Let's go back to the application we built yesterday. Okay, yesterday, we built a website on their default website that had a new SQL Server logging module. Okay, for those of you that were not here, it's a very simple logging stuff. It's just an HTTP module that listens to the log request, new event in the IIS7 pipeline, and then handles that event to actually do the logging. In this case, we're hard coding right here the connection string, which is not the most flexible way of doing things, and boom, just go to SQL Server. What we want to do, our goal for today, is extend the configuration system of IIS and have this connection string be part of our application host.config. Now, all of you guys I know are expert in .NET, and the first question that you will ask me is, why don't you use connection strings, the built-in connection strings? Well, the reason is because I just wanted to show how to extend the configuration system. So yes, you can use the connection strings and your life would be easier, but I just want to show you how you can extend it. It was just a sample that I come up with. So, okay, how do we do this? As you can see in the slides, it said that our schema is extensible. Now, these files, IIS schema.xml, you should not touch it. They are system file protected. Don't try to do anything to them because you could, make bad things to the system. What we allow you to do, actually, is to create new files. So in this case, I'm just going to create a new XML file in Visual Studio and go here and start typing. So very easy to type a new configuration schema. Everything starts with a config schema element. Then you specify a section. Okay, here I'm going to add a section. My section, I want it to be named system.webserver, since I'm just going to piggyback on the group, but it could be anything you want to. Okay, it can come from anywhere you want. So in this case, I'm just going to say system.webserver/SQL logging. Okay, my section is going to be called SQL logging. And I wanted to have an attribute called connection string. And it's going to be of type string. And default value, I want it to be whatever I want to. So in this case, I'm just not going to set any default value. And that's about it. I can say, if it's required, if it's not, everything I want. Okay, so now I'm going to save it. We said that our schema files are always in Windows, System32, initserv, config, schema. And I'm going to save it as my, let's call it SQL logging schema.xml. Cool. Just by doing that, I have extended the schema of IIS, and now IIS knows how to talk to this section. Now, in order for you to actually use it, remember the two sections of the file application.host.config. We talked about all the section groups, all the configuration sections, and then all the data. In this case, you also have to add it here to the section group. You would ask, hey, why do I need to do that? Why it wasn't enough to just specify the schema? Well, the reason is because, as we've talked already, there are certain things that the IT pro might want to change. And the IT pro should never care about the schema. He shouldn't change it. It's no need to change it. They should be able to have another location where they are able to, override mode default equals, allow. So here's where they can go and tweak and change anything they want to. There are new other values, such as if you want them to be able to use it in location paths, do you want to be able to read it in partial trust? So .NET has this concept of partial trust. If you need to read one of the settings when running in a hosted environment, you have to set it to require permission equals false. There's a bunch of other stuff, but there are reasons why you also need to tell us, hey, you can use it here, and then just by doing that, that's it. I should be able to now go to my web.config in my server, open this guy right here, and within my system web server, I should be able to use SQL logging connection string equals my connection string, and that's it. So to prevent myself from doing any typos, I'm just going to cut this guy off, put it right here, okay? Save this. And now, how do I actually consume it from Manage Code? Well, there is a new API called Microsoft.Web Administration that will allow you to do that. So I'm just going to add a reference to it. So add reference. And I'm going to browse to it. That is an IIS file, so it's in Windows, System32, inetserv, Microsoft Web Administration. So that's where it actually lives. Once you do that, Microsoft Web Administration will let us read all the configuration system from IIS. So how difficult it is? Well, I can just do Web Configuration Manager. Okay, and in this case, I want to use the Microsoft Web Administration one. .get section, and I'm going to use system.webserver/SQL logging. So we use the exact same name you used in the schema. Okay, so it's a whole path, not just the start. It's a whole path. Get section, and that is going to return me a configuration section. And once I have that guy, I can actually just read the connection string in a loosely typed manner, like this, and cast that to a string. That's it. I'm done. Now I have extended the schema, I have extended the configuration system, and now my application is actually reading this guy. And to prove that everything is running, I can just go to my local host, and everything should just work. First time I start SQL Server. So since I have the SQL logging module, it's going to SQL, so it took a little bit. By the way, that little text right there, it's coming from a handler that I built that is part of the samples that you can download. It's generating the image dynamically and adding like a copyright to it. So it's also part of the solution that you will download. Okay, so that's it. As easy as that. Now I have my web config with my configuration settings all stored right there. I could do that in ASP.NET today, right? I can use system.configuration and just extend it and write a couple of classes and do the same thing. Well, yes, that is true. You can do the same thing today with .NET, but there is a big difference. One, I didn't have to write any single line of code to extend the schema. In .NET, you have to write a class that is a configuration section or a section handler and do a bunch of code in that regard. In here, we don't require you to do that. The other big difference, and when IIS adds a lot of value, is how many of you have had to build your own applications to be able to deliver them to your IT pro or whoever owns the box to install something so that they set up certain settings in your web config? Well, turns out IIS 7 has a new set of tools that allow you to deal with config as well. So one of them is app command. Okay, how many of you have heard about app command? Cool. I'm guessing you guys went to Drew's talk. Anyway, if you don't, anyway. So app command is our application command line that will let you do a lot of interesting stuff with IIS, such as, I can list the sites. Tell me how many sites do I have? Tell me, the application pools. Tell me which modules I have, and it tells me all the modules. Tell me the configuration, list config, scroll that, list config for default website. Okay, and in fact, let's do for my bidder. Whoa, that's way more than I saw in the web config, right? My bidder web config is only this. Where did all that came from? Remember I talked to you about inheritance. You inherit all the config from your parents. So that is pretty cool because you can actually see the real settings. In fact, let's actually do, list me the config, but I only care about the section default document. Boom. But I actually get a merged view, the real config that I get. So you can see that certain, like enabled equals true, that came from the server. Hello.htm came from the local file webconfig, and the other ones came from the parent file. But what it's kind of cool is that I can also go ahead and, okay, list me this guy, but I don't care about IIS settings. IIS settings are useless. I just care about my stuff, okay? But my stuff is also there. So I can do, hey, show me the section, SQL logging, which is my section, okay? Nothing to do with IIS. And I can still use all the things that I do with IIS. So I can list the configuration, but more importantly, I can actually set it. And so for now, let me just back up, because otherwise I'll have to type everything again. Just going to paste this in Notepad for a second. So I can come here and say, I'm going to modify, so not only, wait, I don't know what I did. Okay, instead of listing config, I want to set config for the full website here. And I want to set the SQL logging section, and I want to set the attribute connection string to foo. And it says apply configuration changes. And if I go back to my web.config here, tell me that it changed, and boom, as you would expect, it sets everything that it needs to set. So now I don't no longer need to build scripts to create web configs. I no longer need to do anything. I can just run this command line tools if you want to automate your, moving from development to production kind of stuff. And again, we just set it to the previous value. I set it, and as you would expect, it's back there, the whole thing. Now, there's an obvious issue here, right? My password is clear text. It's right there in face of everyone. That's not the best thing to do. Now I need to deal with, okay, I want to encrypt this thing. Let me write a bunch of encryption providers and do, no. You can just leverage the automatic encryption of IIS and come here to your schema. Remember the SQL logging schema we had? I think I actually have it open here. Yes. So one of the things you can also tell us is, okay, you know what? I want this to be encrypted, okay? So don't set it in a clear text way, encrypt it for me. So just by doing encrypted equals true, I can go ahead and run the exact same command line, okay? You would expect it to see no change. However, the interesting thing is now you don't see the clear text value. In fact, you only get all the encrypted string clearly there. One of the big differences with encryption with ASP.NET and IIS7 is that ASP.NET only supports encrypting the entire section. IIS supports encrypting to attribute levels. So just this particular attribute, I want it to be encrypted. So it's one of the big differences between them. The other big difference is ours is considerably faster. So yes. That is an excellent question. The question is this encryption machine specific? Does it rely on any of the built-in or the machine specific keys? Can I copy it to a UNC share and use the same configuration from multiple machines? And the answer is, it is machine specific. It is using local machine keys, the crypto keys. So no, you cannot just copy it and it will work. However, we thought about it and we knew this was going to be a common requirement. So if you remember, one of the features that I mentioned that we have in IIS is the ability to share the configuration between servers. And in order for you to do that, you have to share the encryption keys as well. So it turns out we actually provide a very easy way of doing it. So if I go to iNet Manager and I go to the server level, there is a nice feature called shared configuration. If I go into shared configuration, it actually allows me to export configuration. And I'm going to place it, I don't know, to some server, blah, 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 blah. And it's going to export the encryption keys along with this config. And it's going to ask you for a password because it's going to be highly, for a very strong password, because it's going to export your encryption keys and it's going to put them in this UNC so that then you can later go to the other machine. So suddenly, after exporting this, I go to my other web farm machine and I say, I want to enable it. And by the way, the config is located in that UNC, and it will import the encryption keys and then set to use the UNC configuration. Now it will work, all this encryption stuff. And just by doing that little step, if I change something here, it changes the entire web farm. So it's a very, very cool feature. We have some guidelines on IIS.net, by the way, which is our website run by the product team. So definitely, I encourage you to look for all this shared configuration stuff. We're also writing a resource kit book, which it's coming out pretty nice. It's mostly oriented to IT pros, sorry. However, it has a lot of useful information for developers. It's actually written by some of us developers on the product team, so we're trying to make it actually add a lot of value. So strongly recommended. Okay. Where was I? Okay, yeah. So, okay, that's cool. Now we're able to read, to set the encryption, but is my application actually going to work? Well, turns out I don't need to do any modifications. My application just keeps running and working as expected, okay? Finally, well, not everything in life is command lines, you know. I actually like, anyone uses VB, Visual Basic Script? JavaScript? Okay, JavaScript wins. So I'm going to create a new JavaScript file, which actually, let's open it here. Okay, so I'm going to create a little JavaScript file to be able to read my settings. So it turns out we also built a COM object for those of you that are not writing managed code, or that you want to use a JavaScript or VBScript to do this, that allows you to set everything. Ooh, for a second I couldn't remember the object. Okay, so this object allows you to get anything you would imagine there. So for example, in this case, I'm just going to say, hey, admin manager, get me the section system.webserver/SQL logging, which is my section, and I want you to read it from machine wherever I'll explain this in a second, app host default website, okay? So remember the hierarchy, all the inheritance we talked about? This COM object requires you to be very specific or how you want to read this. So in this case, I'm telling you, hey, grab machine.config, inherited from the root web config, then application host.config, and now actually read it from the web config of the full website, okay? And now I can say double script.section.properties.item connection string .value, okay? I save that guy, super easy, and if I cross my fingers and I run this, boom, there it is. It's not encrypted, it's actually raw text. So the configuration system automatically decrypts it when you use our APIs to read the values. The same happens if I try to set it. I can just set it the exact same way, and life should be good, and I should be able to just set the value. So basically, you should be able to say equals foo, and then admin manager dot commit changes. And at that point, it will make the changes. Now, one thing to mention is I use an admin manager. This is a read-only copy version. It's a little bit faster, consumes less memory, and has less overhead. But we also provided a writable admin manager. And this one is a little bit more expensive in terms of memory allocations. But it's the only one that allows you to commit changes. So if you want to make changes, you have to go with the writable admin manager. Just a little bit. But you can, of course, still read values and do it with a writable. So that's it. That's JavaScript. But my favorite is using, again, managed code. So I'm just going to go and create a C# application, console application, and just that's OK. So for that, I'm going to add a reference again to our friend, the Windows System 32 INF304 Microsoft Web Administration. And in here, as you would imagine, I have objects that allow me to read it and set it. The best object, at least to me, is Server Manager. Okay, Server Manager allows you to read any of our configuration files, but it also has more than only configuration. So for example, say I want to read all the requests that are running in IIS in this precise moment. Okay, so for that, I can just do for each worker process in Server Manager .worker processes. I can just console write line worker process dot, application pool name. What's the application pool name and what's the process ID? Right. So if I run this guy right here, I can see that my process ID is 2004 and it's running the default application pool. So as easy as that, I can see that indeed, if I go to my processes, there is a w3wp.exe running with process ID. There you go. There you go, 2004. And it is running the default application pool. So quite easy. Now, even better, let's actually do a little test at it. ASPX. Oh, ASPX. And I'm just going to do, a little language C#. I'm just going to do this so that we can actually see something. Script run at equals server. Sorry. Trying to be fast. Void page load. So the only thing I'm going to do is system.threading.thread.sleep for 10 seconds. Okay, one of those standard practices, adding sleep to your code. There you go. So it's just waiting there. And what I want to do is list all the requests that are actually happening. So I'm going to do, oh, by the way, for each request in my worker process, get requests that have been running for more than 1 second. And please print them out to the console. Request.url plus, and of course you get all the information you would expect. You see what's the verb they requested, what's the site ID, what's the which module it's been running. So I can see, okay, this is really difficult to see, right? Let me go to the definition. So you can see the client IP address, you can see the current module that is running, what's the host name, what's the IP address that the user came through, what's the time that it's taken so far. So you can get all that information. So in this case, I'm just going to say the time taken, time lapse. I'm just going to do a white string here and the string. Okay, so I'm just going to request a bunch of these guys again, and I'm going to run my little thingy. And when I run this, I can actually see how long they've been running and all the requests real time. Okay, so I can see absolutely everything from the web server. Question? That's a very good question. How difficult would it be to make this guy go to another server and see the requests that are running on that server? Well, it's as difficult as don't create a server manager, use a little factory called Open Remote, and I pass my IP address or remote server here, and that's it. I run this guy, and now I'm listing the requests on the remote server that are happening there. This API, by the way, remotely goes through DCOM. So you do need to open some of, if you have firewalls in between, it's the only drawback. So it goes through DCOM. Questions? So what are the security implications of this? The security implications are this API, the API specifically, Server Manager, is designed to be used by administrators. Okay, so you have to be running as an administrator to be able to consume all this stuff. Underneath, it uses some of the COM objects, which are, again, remotely ACLed for only administrators. So yes, indeed, it's you have to open firewall rules. There are some configurations you can do for DCOM, but I'm going to skip those. But there are some things you can do if you look into Microsoft.com, how to enable DCOM over firewalls. And it has a bunch of details how you can assign ranges and stuff. But yeah, it's administrator only, this API, by the way. Yes, it's using the identity of the client, yes. Okay, so, but I was not here to show off those requested stuff. I was here to just say configuration section. Actually, in this case, I actually want to grab the config. And I'm going to get, let's call this app host, server manager.get application host.config. And with that config, I can say, actually, let's not do that. Let's do server manager.sites default website. And for my default website, I want to get his web configuration. Okay, super easy. That's it. I don't have to deal with paths or anything else. I'm just saying, give me the config of that guy, and I'm going to do console, actually configuration section equals apphost.get section system.webserver SQL logging and console.writeline section. And as you would expect, I can just read my connection string. And I'm going to run this code right here. And of course, as you would expect, it's really easy. So very simple, very easy to access all this stuff. As you would imagine, I can actually ask for anything I want. So I can go to directory browse and say, hey, is this thing enabled? And just run this guy. And it's going to tell me, no, it's not enabled. So super easy. Again, you can actually save stuff to this guy. So if you do server manager.commit changes, I can say, hey, section enabled equals true. And run this guy. Everything works. But if I go back to my web.config, it changes. And as you would expect, directory browse, now it's actually enabled. So interestingly enough, this API is smart enough. If it needs to save to multiple files, it will save to multiple files, whether it is application host.config, whether it's a root web config, it doesn't really matter. So I'm going to move forward because I'm running out of time. So, okay, pretty cool. So what we saw is how you can easily extend the configuration system of IIS, how easy it is, and how powerful it's going to help you to have COM objects, is going to help you to have command line tools, it's going to help you to have managed code. So if you just plug in into our idea of using our config files, suddenly you don't need to build all that infrastructure, you get it for free. Now, not everything in life can be represented by static XML, right? What happens if you actually want to, so let's go back to our scenario. Our scenario was having logging into SQL Server. So my section has information like my connection string. But what happens if I want to expose to my IT pro or whoever is going to use this tool, how many rows are available in SQL Server? I don't want them to go and start playing with a database and do select star from something, because first of all, they don't know SQL Server, and second of all, I'm scared to do that. I don't want them to be able to go there. I actually want to expose dynamic configuration, not hard-coded XML, to them, but make it available using the same tools that we give you. Well, it turns out we actually have that functionality, and this is not available in Windows Vista, by the way. This is the only thing that you cannot do in Windows Vista today. You have to wait for Service Pack 1, or you can install Service Pack 1 release candidate, which I think it's out or really close to be out. I don't know. But you can do this certainly with Windows Server 2008. The idea is we expose you 3 interfaces. Unfortunately, this is COM only. You can only do this using COM. However, it's very easy to do managed code COM and make it work, and it's exactly what I'm going to do. So the scenario is I want to expose the number of rows that I have in SQL Server in the same configuration section. And I want them to be available both using app command, both using, I'm sorry, not app command, but using scripts and manage code and all the things that I just showed. So I'm going to very quickly switch here. And I do apologize if I start doing a little bit fast stuff, but I want to finish this because it's pretty cool. So I'm just going to build a class library, C#, simple class library, and I'm going to call this TechEd extension. Okay, just going to do that simple project. The one thing is, since I want this to become accessible, I'm just going to go to my build environment and tell Visual Studio, hey, by the way, please register this for COM interop. That way, it will build all the COM interoperability for me automatically. And then I'm also going to say here, this is going to be SQL extension. And I want this to be COM visible. So that's the one thing you have to do. Now, once you do that, then you have to add a reference to our native code API. Okay, our native code API is in Windows, System32, initserv, okay? And in here, there's a file called nativerd.dll. It stands for like native reader, okay? This is our COM API for accessing configuration. So I'm going to add that reference to that guy. As soon as I do that, I can implement my apphost property extension, okay? And just do that. And it's a very, very simple interface. So I'm just going to do that, make it implemented for me, and I'm pretty much done. This is extending the configuration system in a dynamic way. And the things that you get is the property that they're asking for and the element that they're asking for it. So in this case, I'm just going to do a very SQL connection. Connection equals new SQL connection with a connection string. So how do I get the connection string? Well, very easy. The connection string is going to be from the element, the parent element. I'm just going to do properties dot connection string dot string value. Okay. So I get that guy. I have my connection string, and I'm able to open my connection. So connection dot open, and I'm just going to do connection dot create command. So I'm going to create a SQL command. And finally, I'm just going to do command dot command text. Command text equals select count star from log. So very simple SQL. Command dot execute execute scalar. And I'm just going to say p property dot value. So I'm actually going to write the value into the property and just close the connection. So super easy, just like that. I can compile this guy, and it doesn't compile because I have to say true. There you go. So everything succeeded. Cool. Very easy code. Just SQL connection, open. Let me see if I'm not missing anything. Create command, select formula. That's it. Now, how do I expose this in my configuration section? Well, super easy. I just go back to my SQL logging schema and tell, hey, by the way, there's an attribute, nothing new, called count, nothing new, type equals integer, but by the way, it comes from an extension, and the extension is TechEd extension.SQL extension. That's it. I don't need to do anything else. So now, if I go back to my little application here in Manage Code, and I just change this guy again to our SQL logging and say count, nothing else, nothing different, and I just run this code and cross my fingers, I actually get 50. And to prove that this is true, I'm just going to go here, execute 2, 3, 4, 5, request more, run this guy again, and that's not good. Wait a second. Let's go to SQL. Okay. So much for a punchline. Select star from log. Okay, I have to use protected. Okay. We do have 50 rows. Delete from log. Okay. Select start from log. Don't have anything. Refresh, refresh, refresh. It doesn't really work. So somehow this is not running. SQL. Let's do this for a second. Okay. Okay. Something weird happened. Anyway, so if I go back and I run this guy, now we get 6 rows. If I go ahead and refresh a couple of times more this guy, and I run again my little command line, we get 18 rows. So pretty easy. I'm able to expose using the same COM objects, the same managed code, the same script. In fact, here we have the JavaScript stuff, right? And still, our JavaScript should be able to read this value just as easy as reading the connection string. So I'm going to change this to be count, and that's it. So if I run again, test JS. Count the value. This connection string property has not been initialized. That's interesting, because it should have worked. Ooh, yeah, my bad. Admin manager, sorry about that. And then boom, we get 18 rows. So sorry, I was using the writable admin manager, and that has a couple lines of code that I need to add. Cool. So that's new properties. But what happens if what I also want to add is the ability to do something, to clear a collection, to, you know, if my IT pro starts using this tool and he realizes, okay, we have 10,000 rows, I want to delete them, how is he going to do it? So it turns out we also allow you to add behavior to our configuration sections. So to do that, it's actually as simple as implementing an IAppHost method extension. Okay? So in this case, what I'm telling the configuration system is, oh, and by the way, I also want to provide a method. And so in this case, the interface is as simple as the other one. Now I'm actually just going to provide a method. We get different arguments. In this case, we tell you which method it is. So I should be doing method dot name equals, let's add a method called clear. If it's the clear, and to make my life a little bit simpler, I'm just going to copy paste that code. And instead of that, I'm going to say delete from log. And I don't need to set anything back. I'm just going to say execute non-query. Okay, I do realize this is not the most beautiful code, but it does the trick. So, okay, very easy. I'm extending the configuration system with a clear method. I read the connection string, create a connection, open a connection, and just delete from log. Super easy. Now, how do I hook this with my config system? Well, the only thing I have to do now is tell us, oh, and by the way, there is a method called clear that I want you to expose, and it's handled by the exact same extension. That's it. I don't need to do anything else. So if I go back and come here to my manage code thing, I'm going to copy that 2 times, and I'm just going to say section dot methods clear. I'm going to create an instance of that, and I'm going to invoke it. Execute. So using the same API, again, this works remoting, right, over remote connections. So this could be running on a separate machine. You don't need the COM object here. My extension only needs to be on the server. But all of this actually works remotely. And I can just go here and run this, and guess what? I'm going to issue the count, then I'm going to clear, and hopefully, if things go well, this should show 0. Boom. So 18, and now we have 0. So super easy. Okay, we are 1 minute before we end the session. So benefits, you get all the tools. By the way, all the week I'm going to be downstairs on the Ask the Experts booth in case you have any questions. Almost running late. So appcommand.exe, you get command line support, you get user interface, you get WMI, you get scripting, you get managed code, you get everything just for using our configuration system. So seriously, think about it. I think it's worth it. Okay. Finally, IIS Manager. Completely rewritten using managed code. Okay. Using .NET, it's built in WinForms, and it's completely extensible through a set of DLLs. It's built on top of a web service infrastructure. So everything runs over SSL. In this case, to use the UI remotely, you do not need to open any firewall ports. You don't need anything at all. It will just work. We have a service running, and the idea is this service, called the Web Management Service, is a standalone web server which listens over the port 8172. And what's really interesting is that if you build your extensibility of the UI, you automatically get remoting over SSL for us, because your web service runs here, and we talk to the proxy, and everything should just work. We also have the ability to update the clients. So if you install a new feature on the server, then your clients, upon first connection, will get this dialog asking them, hey, do you want to download these features? And they can choose which ones they want. The publisher will be checked, and we will download and push the new UI. It's very simple to extend the IIS Manager, and so I'm just going to skip that for a second. I'm not going to do the whole demo, but I just want to show you how really easy and powerful these ideas are. So what I'm going to do is open our administration.config. Remember that there were 3 files, application.config. Well, administration.config is the file that drives the UI. All the user interface is driven by this little guy right here. And so I have extended the UI and added a bunch of features right here. So I'm just going to uncomment them so that they actually show. And as easy as that, if I launch the UI, it doesn't really work. Did I do anything wrong? Can I duplicate with IIS reports? Okay, I have IIS reports. Okay, sorry. Okay, coming back. There's a bunch of new things that we didn't have before in the UI. You might not even notice them, but like this little guy right here, the recent tasks, that's completely new. Okay, that was not there, and it allows me to navigate quickly to the features. So it's an extensibility sample. You can download the source code in my blog, by the way, of that little guy. There's an IIS reports feature that gives you reports about the web server. So this is, again, how you can give you some ideas on how you can extend. It uses a chart control I built for ASP.NET. Very simple stuff. You can just, play around. It has a bunch of different reports about remote management, who has connected to your remote machine. So some ideas that we built. I also built one database manager. So if you don't have SQL Server and you want to manage this remotely, it just makes sense, especially if you're a hoster. And so now I can actually see my connection streams right here. And this is all going over SSL. So I don't need to have any SQL Server installed locally, and you get database management. You have the ability to print a diagram. You have to be able to see the table definition. You can change the data types. You can issue new queries. Basically, the idea is to build kind of like a whole, SQL Server manager on top of IIS Manager. There's a registry editor that I built as well, so it allows you to see all the registry. And again, all of this is remotely over SSL, so pretty cool stuff. So even if you're over the internet, you can connect to your machine and do a bunch of neat little things. I built, and by the way, I built a sample for the feature that we were showing off. And so, it allows you to change this, this code, by the way, for this UI, it's in the material that I'm going to upload, you can download. So how to extend this guy, how to issue, requests and get all the logs. So sorry about that. I really run late. Thank you very much. Quick summary. IIS provides everything end-to-end whether it's runtime, whether it's config, whether it's UI. You can extend everything and make it look and feel as if it was part of the platform. Please make sure to fill out the evaluations. You might win some nice prizes. And again, the home of the IIS team is IIS.net. We upload a bunch of samples. There's tons of content there. Make sure to take a look, check it out. We don't do anything about, it's just for the community, so it's not like we make money or anything. But we do want people that feel lost to find your way if you, ask questions there. So thank you. And oh, yeah. So my blog, if you can, today I'll have all this content there. It's blogs.msdn.com.carlosag. My email alias is carlosag@microsoft.com. In case you need anything, do feel free to let me know, and I'll see how I can help you. My blog? Actually, my blog is in MSDN, but it's replicated into IIS. So yes, in IIS, you'll see blogs.is. Yes.